This is a conversation with Dal Domebo. Dal is an American Indian, indigenous people, or tribal cultural leader here in the Wichita area. He plays a big part in the local school district here to help youth of the American Indian culture to succeed. He is also the current chairman on the Board of Trustees for the Mid-American All-Indian Museum in Wichita, Kansas. One of the biggest questions I had for Dal was, how does he feel Native American history is taught in today's education? We also hit on more subjects within the culture. While this conversation was only about 50 minutes long, I know I left a lot on the table to be asked. But this is a subject that I'm passionate about and that I will continue to research and continue to have people of the culture on here. I want to thank Dal and his wife for taking time out of their day so that this conversation could happen. While it's important to note that the United States has faced its challenges during its history, I want to emphasize that my intention is not to criticize America. This is a beautiful country, and I take pride in being American. We are all aware that the United States has encountered its share of difficulties, but courageous individuals from diverse backgrounds have continuously contributed to its improvement year after year. I genuinely believe that America's greatness lies in its ability to engage in civil discussions, learn from history, appreciate our differences, and grow together. Now, without further ado, let's dive into my conversation with Dal Domebo. I'm your host, Lee Bird, and this is the Search Podcast. All right, but first, I want to go ahead and thank you for your time. Coming over here and taking time out of your day for this. So
no problem.
Thank you very much for that.
Thanks for the invite.
There's a couple things I want to get out of the way real quick, because when I listen to podcasts and I hear a guest on there, sometimes I'm always searching where they're born and, grew up and stuff like that. So just curious where you were born and raised.
Born and raised in Wichita. I'm a product of USD 259. I went to the path I took was Longfellow, Hamilton, and I graduated from West High. So, born and raised in Wichita. Both my folks are from down in Oklahoma, but
okay.
Yeah, so.
All right. And then so your parents being born down there in Oklahoma, so were you always raised within the culture or?
Yes, I'm fortunate. Both my parents were native. Or are native, and my dad is full-blooded Kiowa, and my mom is Ponca and Quapaw. So they met at Haskell, and then they moved to Wichita after they left there. And so even though I grew up urban, so to speak, in Wichita, we had the connection to the culture throughout my entire life. I always kind of tell people when I do my presentations that I was fortunate to where I was brought up in two different worlds, to where with the urban Wichita side and then my cultural side. So,
okay, so that's really neat. And then, so you were raised within it, and then, both worlds, I guess you said. So, did you want to keep keeping your culture alive, after high school and everything like that?
Yeah. As I said, we grew up in it and we practiced it, and we were the stereotypical, at the time, and I guess still to this day, we were the stereotypical Indian family, to whereas we were poor. So like on spring breaks, summer vacations, things like that, my friends would go to Colorado or to Disneyland or Disney World or just down in Texas in the Gulf. And they had neat vacation stories when they came back. But we were, like I said, we were poor. So our vacations were going down to the reservation, visit with my family, because I've still got a lot of kinfolk that is down in the reservations on both sides of my family. So that's where we would go. But, no matter what, we still participated in the customs. And I always knew it was something important to do, to be able to hold on to them and to keep practicing them, because I got that from my parents, but also I got that from my grandparents. And I knew it was important to do that. The one thing I was naive in as growing up, I just assumed that if you were Indian, you knew your culture, you practiced your customs and things like that. But it wasn't until high school, I guess, that I realized not everybody that's Indian actually did that, because I there were a lot of kids in high school that I went to high school with that were Indian, but they didn't really know anything. And I was like, that's kind of odd, But then I grew up. Once I went to college, I got done, I started working, and I got a job with the program that I'm in now with the Wichita Public Schools as the Native American program. And I realized a lot of these kids are like me. I mean, growing up in Wichita, but they really don't know anything about the culture. And I'm like, wow, So that's when I really realized how fortunate I was growing up, learning and practicing. So I wanted to make sure that whenever I had kids, I wanted to make sure I was passing it along. So, because I do know how important that is.
Right. I have a lot of Native American in my family history, specifically on my mom's side, being down from like the Oklahoma Arkansas
Mm.
border down in that area. It was something that I was never really taught. It seems like in general education, and we'll get to that here in a minute, but it seems like it's just kind of real fast through general education even, and it's a big part of American history. I mean, it's the start of American history, and we'll get into all that. So actually, that brings me into, one of my first big questions. So how do you perceive Native American culture and history in general education these days, or just being taught at all?
I think there's a lack of it due to, as the story goes, this history is told by the winners, by the side of the winners. And unfortunately, and as you mentioned, Native history is a huge part of American history. Unfortunately, it's not told thoroughly or accurately enough, in my opinion. The biggest thing, like when I go to and speak at schools or speak anywhere for that matter, one of the things I like to ask is, what is their opinion, or what do they feel is the I'm trying to remember how I word it. What is the biggest genocide or biggest travesty in all of human history?
Right.
And 9 times out of 10, the kids will say, or anybody that I'm talking with will say, the Holocaust, which is obviously a tragedy. I mean, that's something that you can't explain that away. You can't. I mean, it's just, and you ask them, well, how many Jews were sacrificed or killed for them, and it's over 6 million, which is tragic. I mean, that's something that could have been avoided. But luckily they have that history and they know all of that over there, for the sole purpose of making sure something like that doesn't happen again. Yeah, then I kind of turn it to them and say, you know what, that's, as tragic as that is, as far as lives lost, that's nothing compared to what happened here in America. I mean, here in America, as far as Indian Removal Act, Manifest Destiny, all of everything, ever since Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492, since that time there was an effort, and then that effort cost my ancestors, my people, to the tune of over 100 million of us were dead, were killed just for the land. So that's, you'd have to take the Holocaust and
Right.
double, triple, So it is a big part of it, and it needs to be told. It needs to be done, just for the same reason that the Holocaust is taught.
Mm-hmm.
Because we don't want that to happen again. There's no sense in it, So that's so. As far as if you're asking, well, how accurate is it in school? Unfortunately, it's only kind of a blip right now. And even when I was in school, it was just kind of a blip, and like, well, this happened, and then boom, and then unfortunately, this day and age in certain parts of the country, it's getting even shorter and shorter as far as what can be taught or even how it's presented. So that's one thing that I think is that is lacking in education today. So,
And especially that they try to make it all be like a good story.
Yeah.
Like the Pocahontas deal too. That's after kind of doing some some of my own research, that really wasn't that great of a
or
story.
the Thanksgiving with the Pilgrims and the Indians. The feast. That happened, but it only happened once. After that, it kind of went downhill. So
It did, yeah. And since you bring that up, that's something that. Okay, I got two things in my research on this stuff. So I've said it already a couple times. Native American. Now that's a name given from colonizers, correct? And I've heard, or what I've read, I mean, it can be different from tribe to tribe, but um, is that a name that's kind of disrespectful a little bit? Native
the term
American?
Native American.
Yeah.
It's more of a, I guess, sign of the times, because now I see it starting to evolve to where we are being called indigenous. Mm-hmm. I see it more as a preference thing, because when I was growing up in school, we were called American Indian.
American Indian. Yeah.
So I mean, some people like the term, still use the term Indian or American Indian. Some use Native American. Some are starting to incorporate the indigenous in there. Mm-hmm. None of them, in my opinion, none of them are disrespectful. Okay. I mean, it's just more of a, I guess I'd just consider it more of a moniker. Usually when you're talking to Indians, most of the time, because when people come up to me and ask me, they'll know, well, you don't look Hispanic, or what race are you? And I'll tell them I'm Kiowa, Ponca, and Quapaw, mm-hmm. which are my three tribes. And I know a lot of Indians, I know a lot of individuals that's how they introduce themselves when somebody asks them, well, what nationality are you? Because each tribe, we are our own nation. Right. I mean, and that's one of the biggest misconceptions that I see nowadays is most people think that, well, if you're Indian, Native American, whatever you want to call it, that, we all speak the same language, mm-hmm. And it's not that way. Like I said, I'm Kiowa, Ponca, and Quapaw. All three tribes have three very distinctly different languages. Right. So, and every tribe is that way. Now, some tribes, like Lakotas and Dakotas, it might be pretty similar, and some words kind of cross over, but for them, we all have our own governments, we all have our own customs, traditions, all of that stuff. So
right, yeah. So even from reservation to reservation, those act as different nations today. Even isn't that?
Yeah, because there's about 574 federally recognized tribes. That doesn't even count state recognized tribe, but and each one of them are their own sovereign nation. So,
and some do better than others. I mean, that's one thing you kind of run into. It's just history of the world, really. Like some do really well, like the Cherokee one in North Carolina. Mm-hmm. And then there's other ones that they have that, nepotism throughout the top of the tribe and stuff like that. So yeah, that's what I thought was neat. So even before first contact, that they were, each tribe was, like you said, their own nation within the whole North American continent. Mm-hmm. So I found that to be really cool, that that they probably had trade and things like that between tribes and everything. Mm-hmm. So, okay, but the other thing you brought up, Thanksgiving, that's viewed completely different, and that should be obvious, really, for us, of how natives, view Thanksgiving.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and a lot of Indians, we will look at it as, or refer to it as, a day of mourning. Not that we're not thankful for what we have, because we do give thanks to the Creator for everything that we do have. So it's not a matter of not giving thanks. I mean, but that particular holiday, I guess, is especially if you're looking at like the Wampanoag tribes, or tribes down out east where all of it first started. They look at it as a day of mourning, and that's how they recognize it on that day. And they'll go to the sites, Plymouth Rock or anywhere else, and they'll mourn and they'll pray for those that lost. So, but yeah, for the most part, it's not viewed that way. I mean, viewed the way most America sees it because of the history behind it. Like I said, the warm and fuzzy picture you see every November with the pilgrims and the Indians sitting down to eat and peacefully and having fun. That happened one time. After that, it kind of went downhill. So
treaty
in
after
the
treaty after
yeah,
treaty,
and the fact that when they came over, they didn't know how to handle the winter. They didn't know how to handle the soil that was here, so they could not. Basically, they could not have survived. So they couldn't survive a winter. But the tribes that were up in that area, they helped them. They taught them how to farm. They taught them how to fish. They taught them what crops grew best where, and they did all of this to help them. And then come that next year, they had crops. They taught them how to hunt, where to hunt, all of that, kept them alive. Taught them how to survive, and that was that one meal that they were grateful for. But then after that, um, long story short, basically, in their eyes, we outgrew our purpose. We outgrew our usefulness. So then from there, they're like, well, because they saw it as all this land and there's nobody is claiming it, but we don't see it that way. You can't own the land. You can't put it in your pocket and just what. So whenever all that happened, they made sure that they had to get rid of us because they saw us as, I don't know if they saw us as landowners. So if we can get rid of the landowners, then we can have the land. So that's when all the massacres started. They would go from village to village and kill all the warriors that were there, all the men that were there, the women and children. Rather than waste bullets, they would, beat them to death, with the butts of the rifles, things like that, or burn the villages. I mean, and it gets more gruesome than that.
It
But I mean,
does.
that's significant enough to speak on. But yeah, those types of things happened and were. So that's those types of things, and it went on for so many years. And every time they conquered another settlement or another village, they had a day of thanks. Another day of Thanksgiving, another day of Thanksgiving, another day of Thanksgiving, until it got to be just too much to where, finally the president would step in and say, okay, let's just pick one day, and all of these quote unquote victories, we'll just use this one day as our day of Thanksgiving. And that's where it came from. And that's why we look at it as, not our favorite holiday, so to
Right.
speak.
Yeah, and it's understandable with just the amount of tragedy that's happened, And that's one thing when I got more curious about it and, wanted to know more about my past history and my family history. And, because nowadays we're all so spread out between,
Yeah.
cultures and everything, except for when you got very few, full-blood natives and everything like that. So, but it's very interesting, and there's something I like to learn about is just history in itself and how they viewed the world. I wish there was a little more kind of documentation or understanding of how they lived before first contact. And I know there's some, and there's stories to be told from the tribes and their own reservations, and I'd love to get into that someday, but it's so fascinating how they viewed the earth and how everything like that. So could you share some insights into Native American history about things that might not be widely known?
Yeah, as far as the history and the diversity and things that we have within our culture, as I'd mentioned, there are over 570 federally recognized tribes, and each one with their own customs, traditions, things like that. And I was fortunate to be able to grow up with those traditions and customs, and I am fortunate to be able to pass them down to my daughters. One of the things as far as being able to do that, that's the biggest, I don't know if you want to call it evolution for our people, is because at one time and not very long ago, it was illegal for us to practice our customs.
Mhm.
We were,
Yeah.
I have grandparents that were in boarding schools. I have grandparents that were, and great grandparents that were persecuted for practicing. Even our dances that you see at powwows, they weren't able to freely practice those. There's different dances, there's different rituals, there's different things that we do as a people that were considered illegal. It wasn't until I believe it was 1978. It was I can't remember the exact name of it, but basically it was a Native American Religious Freedom Act or something, to where it made it legal for us to be able to have a lot of the customs and a lot of the rituals and things that we have that we hold very dear, that have been with us for centuries. Like some of the dances that we have, peyote meetings, smudging ceremonies, things like that, were finally not illegal. And that's, if you look at it, it's 1978. I mean, I'm old, but I'm not that old, and I was alive whenever that thing finally passed. Now, I didn't remember what it was because I was born in 1971, but still that kind of gives you a sense, because a lot of people think, well, all that bad stuff happened a long time ago. It's not that long ago.
It really wasn't.
When you look at it another way, voting rights, whenever they passed the amendments for women to vote, and then they passed amendments for African Americans to be able to vote, if you look at the verbiage, it was specifically tailored to where it excluded us. And then we didn't finally get the right to vote. And once we finally did, they still allowed for us to be able to vote. They let the states still determine if we could vote. We didn't gain the right to vote in every single state until 1962. So there's always been some kind of, and then there, just as recently as I think it was 2018, to where they were trying to take it away by putting different caveats in there as far as how to qualify to be able to vote. So yeah, it's those types of things. Ancestors of ours paid those prices way back then, to where we can have the freedom to be able to practice our culture today. So
right. It wasn't until 1924 too. I forget the name of that act.
To where we were Americans.
Yeah.
So yeah,
given American citizenship.
So we've been Americans for we've been here for centuries, but we've only been quote unquote American citizens. Next year we'll hit 100. So
right.
Kind of crazy when you think about it that way.
It is, yeah. Because that was one question I had, but I ended up looking it up and figuring it out, was that if there's somebody still born on the reservation, or native, land, if they were a U.S. citizen also, and they are,
Right.
if they're born today on the reservation. Yeah. So, yeah, that was one thing I was kind of curious about, because of all the, they're able to have their own laws. And I know that's viewed a little, the IBA or what? BIA. Okay. Yeah. So I know that's not too welcomed anymore, really. It seems like on the reservations, it seems like. So
yeah. Well, BIA, as far as that goes, on reservations themselves, BIA is the only authority allowed on there. Mm-hmm. Because usually reservations obviously are, within cities themselves, or maybe on the outskirts of the cities, but local authorities can't go on reservations. It's illegal for them to do so. So that at a certain point they kind of stop, and then from there, like just, as one small example, like when I have relatives that pass away, a lot of times the ceremonies might be in town or something, but then when we go bury them at the tribal, the burial grounds, then the city authorities or they stop at a certain point, and BIA's there, and then they take it from there. So it's unless you're used to seeing it, it's kind of different seeing BIA cops for the very first time, at that thing, because it is different, and it's noticeably different than when they're there. So, and it just kind of takes on. I mean, I grew up with it, so I'm used to it. But my wife is non-native, so whenever she saw that for the first time, it didn't freak her out, but it was noticeable. So
it is, yeah. Just from a lot of my research on it, that I found out like that's still I guess for lack of a better term, still Big Brother trying to have a hand in
Yeah.
there
Hmm.
in some ways, even though they want to leave it or say it's a sovereign nation, but they still have the BIA in there, and I'm not too sure of the whole role they play much anymore. I'd come across that, but I forgot.
Kind of
Anyway.
one of those here. This is your land. You can do what you want as long as we approve type thing.
Oh,
So
okay. Yeah. Yeah. So there's just things you just keep finding out, more and more. That's,
yeah, the farther you dig, the more you find. So and that's what I always tell people. It's like, because they want to know, quote unquote, tell me everything. And it's like, how much time do you have, but you can, do the research. And that's luckily one of the things that are around now. They can find out a lot of information on their own. So that way, because we were always taught growing up, don't take anybody at their word, find out for yourself, don't, just because I say it or somebody else says it, don't, oh, well, they said this or that. It doesn't matter what they said. Find out, that way,
right. That's been my best way is just to keep digging and digging and digging and find out. And you find out, though, that every tribe has different viewpoints and everything like that. Because, like we said earlier, they're basically their own different nations.
Right.
So they're very similar going back in history, but they operate like different states or countries. Right. So, okay, so I want to go back to one thing about not being able to practice, rituals and things like that. That seems like a way to kind of kill off the culture, is how they were trying to do it back then. But since it's been brought back and all these dances and rituals, they still teach them these days. There's just like a sense of like you can tell of how much they mean to the culture when they're able to do those. Like one thing I learned about and I thought was really cool was the sweat houses. You know those.
Yeah.
But not only that, but the rock. The whole story about why putting the rocks in there in the sweat house.
Yeah, to keep the heat. Yeah.
But how the rock is viewed, is like the original Earth, right? Like there's just a real deep meaning into it.
Yeah, that's kind of the beauty of the culture is everything has a purpose. Everything has a meaning for it. So like I said, that's one of the things, when you start to study it and when you start to talk, especially when you start talking to elders, you gain that knowledge. So
yeah, I think it's cool to be able to keep that, passed down. It's awesome. It's just, I don't know. It's just, there's something so interesting about how everything meant so much, every piece of land and everything. It's really cool and it's neat to learn about. Yeah. What are some like key misconceptions about Native American culture or history or basically the culture that you would like to?
I guess biggest one we kind of touched on a little bit is how every tribe is different. Every tribe is their own nation. I mean, because like I said, growing up, a lot of people always used to say, say something in Indian, but it's like, okay, I'm three different tribes, what do you want? It's like, well, just say hi or just say that. It's like, I'm three different tribes. There's three different greetings, and then sometimes, the translation is different, because we don't have a word for like airplane because we didn't have airplane, so it's, that's one of the biggest misconceptions is that if you're Indian, we all speak the same language, which we don't. Other than that, some of the other stereotypes or misconceptions are, well, you get to go to college for free, you get free money, you get free land, you get all these benefits. If we do, I'm still waiting for mine, because I don't get that. Nowadays there's some like kids, for higher education purposes, but that comes from COVID money. There's, but every tribe for the most part has some kind of not allotment, but reserves for higher education, because every tribe sees the significance and the importance of higher education, educating the children. And that's one of the main things that our ancestors, when these treaties were put in place, that was one of the biggest things our ancestors wanted, was to make sure you educate our kids. And that's the reason that the program that I'm in charge of, that's the reason that we exist, because of those treaties, because of our ancestors that fought for that. And that's, the misconception, is, well, Indians are lazy. Indians are, they're just bums. They're drug addicts. They're alcoholics. They're dumb. They don't, uneducated. Those blah, blah, blah. But that's what we have to counter. That's what, like I said, my program that I run in charge of, that's the main thing, is to make sure that as many of our students graduate as possible, because statistically speaking, Native Americans have the lowest graduation rate of any ethnic group in the country, within the whole country. So that's why, like I said, programs like mine exist, so that we can combat that. And then we've got to use the funds that's available to us to be able to help support our students that are in the district, so that they can get across that stage with that piece of paper.
Right. Yeah, that's nice that there's things like that. And definitely, if to help keep their culture alive, and to know their history, and so that's really awesome that you're such a big part of that here in this area. In today's world, what can people do to help support Native Americans, and help them to keep their traditions alive and their culture alive?
Biggest thing is support. I mean, support activities that happen, that go on. I know a couple weeks ago, or maybe it was even last weekend, there was a Hispanic Heritage type event going on in Wichita, at the Mid-America All Indian Museum, which is a museum in town and it's the only organization in town that's solely dedicated to teaching and preserving Native American culture and educating to be able to pass it on. So there's a lot of cultural events that happen there, and everything, as far as the program that I'm in charge of, everything that we do is free and open to the public. Okay. As well as the cultural events that's held at the museum, they're free and open to the public, and we would love and throw out the welcome mat to have everybody come, because it's through those types of interactions, those types of activities, that we can kind of break down those educational gaps, to be able to, that allows people to come and ask. I mean, you have to ask to get the answer. Don't just speculate, don't just assume, but you can go and say, oh, well, that's interesting. Like you had mentioned, everything, there's a reason for everything. There's as far as when we do things, there's a reason, there's a significance. And to be able to come, because that's what we want as a people, is to educate, to be able to pass it down, so that we can close that gap. And then, so to be able to have them come and say, I noticed this, why is that? Sit down, let's talk.
Right.
And that way we can break that barrier. That way we can move forward, not just as a Native people, but as a people in general, because then that way there's a better understanding of our culture by non-natives. And okay, then that's when we can move forward as a society. I mean, until then, if you still got you got to, but the one thing I would caution on that is to make sure that when we do that, don't get so enamored that, oh, well, I mean, I feel like I've got a closeness to you. I feel like I'm saying, I feel it in my heart that I'm Indian, and I should, I can tell your stories now too, because I've sat down. No, you can't. I mean, not to be disrespectful, but that you can't. Just like as I can't speak on Hispanic culture, or African American culture, or Irish culture, or whatever other culture, because I'm not that culture. So even though I could do extensive study on it and talk to individuals from those cultures, that doesn't make me that, So there's a difference between taking an interest and learning and being earnest in your the way you go about getting the knowledge and trying to be that, and that's basically akin to, wearing a headdress on Halloween.
I was gonna
So
I was gonna bring that up actually within this. So if people were to go there, maybe they could learn about the headdress, or since you're here.
the different types of regalia, especially at a powwow. You'll see dancers wearing all different types of regalia, and each regalia is coupled with a certain type of dance style, and those dance styles, all have significance. So that, like I said, those types of activities, people can come and speak directly with those dancers and say, "Can you tell me more about your dance style? Can you tell me more about the regalia you wear and the significance of it and things like that?" But I would caution, make sure you just don't go up and start touching, especially if there's feathers involved. But dancers are always more than happy to explain their culture and explain their dance, explain their regalia. So
The headdress, if I remember right,
somebody that wears a headdress, it's a significance thing. I mean, it's somebody that's a significant figure within the tribe. So it's not something that's why it's such a hot button issue. Whenever you see these celebrities that are kind of full of themselves and throw headdresses on or something, that's very disrespectful. So and the thing is, then you hear that, well, I'm trying to honor you, and it's like, that's not honoring, and that's where I talk about, that's where the gap is. There's that gap. You're not understanding. I'm not, let's just talk, but if you don't want to sit down and talk, then you're just blatantly being disrespectful. Okay. But if somebody wants to sit down and say, if somebody tells me, hey, what you're doing, it's not right. Well, okay, what am I, can you explain to me? Yeah, sure. Then that's when you can kind of close that gap. But if somebody turns a deaf ear, I don't want to hear that, I don't care, then that's where the problems happen. So
it is, yeah. I'm pretty ignorant about a lot of this too, and it's been so fun to go down this road and to learn a lot of things. And you're right, that a common theme I see is that the natives want to tell their own story, and I'm perfectly fine with that, because who better to tell it than them themselves, and just to learn about all the rituals and everything, for them, or you guys to be able to tell that, it's awesome. So I'm gonna have to get into more of it, eventually. I need to get down there. Actually, I've only been there, it's probably been 20 years or so, but I'll leave a link to that, you know.
Yeah, and actually, the next big one is October 7th, which is a couple weeks from today.
Okay.
And it's called Indigenous Peoples Remembrance Day. And we're going to have one of the things we'll do is we'll call it Trail of Tears Memorial Walk. Okay. And it'll be held in the backgrounds of the Mid-America All-Indian Museum. But we'll also have a lot of different resources there, and a lot of different there'll be like a booth that gives information about just general information about boarding schools, why that was a disaster. There's also the MMIW, Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women, information on that. But then there'll be other booths like that, kind of as resources to be able, like I said, to be able to help, that, if somebody doesn't have as much information or as knowledge as they would like, they can get it at these types of events. So that I would encourage, and it's free and open to the public, and it's from 10 to noon. So anybody that's interested or anybody that would like to come down there, feel free. I mean, we'll be down there. The program that I'm in charge of, we'll have a booth set up as well. So,
okay. That'll be awesome. I'm going to try to get down there. So there's another thing you mentioned in there, the missing women, that's still something that's happening today. Even you pointed out another thing too, like that all natives are getting checks and getting paid and things like that, but life is actually still pretty rough sometimes. I mean, they have a lot of good, but they have problems, with people coming on the reservations and, kidnappings and things like that. So
Yeah. Well, and then as far as when you say checks, I mean, it's mainly just kind of those that are on the reservations, they live, hand to mouth pretty much because it's government handouts. I mean, there's not, like I said, we don't, if we're supposed to be getting money, like I said, where's my check? Because I've never received anything. So, I mean,
and really a lot of that hasn't come till now with the casinos and things like that.
Yeah, and there's tribes that but then unfortunately, there are some tribes that have taken advantage of that and have kind of left their citizens out of that. Unfortunately, the greed is a nasty sin. So,
it is, and that's what I said earlier, that there's some of them do it right and do the people right, and then you still have that nepotism within the certain tribes or nations. So kind of the same thing, you see that throughout just the history of the world. Is just how people are. It seems like you got your good ones, and then you have, unfortunately, the bad ones. But is a historical trauma still like a thing you hear about from when you go back to like, your relatives and things like that?
yeah, I mean, as far as the trauma, I mean, I remember. I mean, as far as what happened to our people, the slaughtering of over 100 million of us. I mean, those of us that are here today, that was far enough back. But as far as the recurring trauma, I mean, I don't know if you want to call it recurring trauma, but there's definitely recurring effects that affect us even today. I mean, so. I would just kind of think back. I mean, whenever I think, like my grandma, I remember one of my grandma. I mean, she would, when I was younger, she told us one time about her, because she was in a boarding school. Right. She was taken from her family. And she used to tell us, or she told me one time, and back then I regretted asking her about it because it made her cry. But she talked about, because my grandma's first language is not English, or was not English. She's passed away by now, but her first language is Ponca. And so she was taken when she was 8 years old, I think. And she said that because the boarding school she went to just happened to be ran by the Catholic Church. And she said the nuns, and as well as the fathers, would physically beat them with their fists. These are little girls. If they spoke their language, and they forced them to speak English. So that's how she learned English. She by being have to do it. There's a gentleman, within the community. He doesn't do it anymore, but he used to tell stories about when he was in boarding schools. So there's still people alive today. I mean, they're elders. They're up, up there in age, but they still remember that. And then when they tell these stories, it has an effect on us, even though it doesn't matter how tough we think we are. It's like, wow, I can't imagine that. Like, just to bring it to more recent, like we were talking about, I mean, there was also an effort after the boarding schools failed. There was an effort to it's like, okay, we can't get rid of them that way, because way back when they thought the overlying idea was if we kill all the buffalo, they'll die because they can't survive without it, which is a good thinking on their part, I guess. But it didn't work. I mean, it was effective, but it didn't work because we're still here, obviously. But then kill the Indian, save the man, which is the boarding schools. And then after that, into the 60s and 70s, there was sterilization, where they were sterilizing 12, 13, 14-year-old girls. And this was in the 60s and 70s. I was born in 71. And then they said, I think the estimate is about 25 to 30% of Native girls were sterilized, and as young as 14. And so I survived. It's like, well, if it's only 25%, you get a 75% chance. Yeah. But my question was, what were the chances of you dying, when you were born? My chances were 25 to 30%, but if that would be me, then that would mean I wouldn't have three younger brothers. That would mean I wouldn't have my daughters, and then eventually they'll have children of their own. So you can see the snowball effect, So like I said, as far as the trauma, those are the types of recurring trauma that happens, and that's just modern. I mean, that's not that far away. I mean, even though young people see me as old, I don't see it as that far away, And like you had mentioned earlier, the us being citizens wasn't until 1924, So we haven't even been citizens for 100 years yet, So that's what I mentioned earlier, That's why, as far as these types of stories, these types of educational facts need to be taught, because if not, we're gonna repeat them. Like I said, that's why the Holocaust, it's taught for the sole, one of the sole purposes was so that people know this is something bad that happened. We don't want this happening again. But if you try to, as far as our history, try to wish it away, it could happen again. So when you ask, what about the recurring trauma? Those are the types of traumas that have the lingering effect. I mean, does it mean trauma like, well, I can't get a job, or I can't? No, but it's the anguish that we know, because I do still know. I remember my grandma telling me this with tears in her eyes.
Right.
I remember my grandpa saying a couple of things that happened to him, and it's like, wow, I haven't had to go through anything, relatively speaking, But those are the type of effects that should spur us that are still here to do the best we can for them, because they made a huge sacrifice. I know we do sacrifice. We have sacrifices and things in day-to-day lives and things, but nothing compared to what they had to go through.
Exactly. I hate to, have you come on here and then just make the whole history seem like it was doom and gloom, but that's just from first contact is when it got really bad, and I think the best way to learn about it is, like you said, just going to places. Like, we're fortunate enough to have one here in Wichita, that cultural center that you can go to and ask questions and learn and see the better part,
Yeah.
of the traditions that they've always lived and known before all the doom and gloom happened. Right, you can go see the beauty, I guess, of the culture.
The things that our ancestors had to endure were for the purpose of us to be able to not only survive but thrive. And that's what I see as my job, my purpose. Just like people that are Indians that are alive, that are still here now, I think we as a collective people, regardless of tribe, to do our ancestors proud.
Mm-hmm.
They did what they did because they see it as, okay, this is going to help 7 generations down.
Mm-hmm.
Now it's our job to look to the next 7 generations and do what we feel that we can to better them. And that is not to just hide it and say, oh, we won't tell anybody. No.
Mm-hmm.
Share, teach, teach people, teach kids that may not know as much as they would like to know. Teach them the culture so that they can teach it, because eventually they're going to be adults and they're going to have to, because if we don't teach it and then we don't also share it with like non-natives, we're doomed to repeat what happened.
Exactly.
We can't do that. And if we don't teach it and we don't share it and with everybody else and teach it to our youth and teach it to those that may not have the quote unquote, correct blood quantum, which has nothing to do with anything, teach them.
Mm-hmm.
Teach what you know. That way you can go through there. So that way they can go, that way when they grow up, they can pass it down. They can pass it down, keep it going. Because if not, if it dies with this generation, then all of that happened to our ancestors from the time Columbus sailed the ocean blue to all of the stuff, boarding schools, manifest destiny, westward expansion, sterilization, on and on and on and on. All of that, uh, everything, all the policies and all the acts and all the laws that were put in place to get rid of us will have served its purpose.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that's the last thing we want or need. I'm not just saying that as for Indian people, but for the country in general. Because if that goes away, who's to say that a certain other group of people aren't next?
Yeah, exactly. Right. Because anymore, it seems like you don't. The way I was taught about the Native American history from like first contact, it seemed like it was all easy going. Back when I was in school, it did learn a little bit about like bringing over disease and things like that, and how much just that wiped out a lot of the population. But I feel like it was kind of glossed over for me. And then to really learn what really happened, and then how it seemed like they just made it harder and harder for them to try to keep their actual culture and way of life alive. It's like, wanted them to convert and everything like that. So, like,
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
oh, you're good.
One of the things, like when you're talking about, when you asked about the recurring trauma and all that, one of the things that I think, I guess the kind of easiest way I kind of look at it when people say, well, when I think, a lot of times throughout my life, I've always heard, well, all that stuff happened a long time ago. Get over it.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes people will actually say, get over it, or they'll say, well, you've got all the opportunities that we have now. That's true to a point. And when when you'd asked about the recurring trauma, and I would just say not so much trauma maybe, but more accurately, recurring effects.
Mm-hmm.
And when I think about that, it's kind of like when I was a kid, we used to have game night all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And my favorite game was always Monopoly.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody starts out with the same amount, then you go around the board trying to collect as much as you can collect and the land you can get, and then bargain and, do all kind of trades with people to try to get, especially the high-end stuff. Yeah. And then you put your house and your hotels, and eventually, of course, the game lasts 4 or 5 hours. But eventually, if people, land on your stuff long enough, then you can collect their money and you can, get most money and win, Mm-hmm. But when you look at it, if you, play a Monopoly, you're 2 or 3 hours into that game, all the property's bought up. Except maybe the utilities, sometimes most people don't like the utilities.
You're right.
But,
yeah.
The property's all bought up, especially Boardwalk Park, plus that one road, Boardwalk Park Place and all them, might, definitely gone first. But all the places are bought up. Most likely, most of them are already, 2, 3 hours into it. They've got houses or hotels in them, so it's hard.
Mm-hmm.
But if somebody new jumps in the game, hey, I want to play, just start me out, let me get in there. It's like, okay, well, start them off with the same amount of money everybody else started with. But that person that's getting in there now really has no chance to win. Mm-hmm. Because there's nobody's going to just give them, well, I've got 2 hotels on Boardwalk here, you can have that. They're not going to do that because that's a money machine, Then every time they land somewhere, you're having to pay, and you're just hoping to get around the board at least once so you can get past go and you can get that $200, or that paycheck. So that's kind of how I see it. So like you said, we haven't even been citizens for over 100. It's less than 100 years. So the game itself doesn't benefit us. Yeah, we can still get on the Monopoly board and still, roll. And, if we get on free parking, we can get the, the money that's there. Or if we win a beauty contest, we can get that $10, or we go past go, we can get that $200. But there are very limited or very few opportunities to be able to get into the quote unquote old boy network, because it's all, well, hey, why don't you, I've got, $2,000 here. I'll give you $1,000. Why don't you give me Park Place? No, Or why don't you give me that? No, I've got houses on there. I've improved that. So that's kind of how I look at it as recurring effects. That sometimes, and that doesn't mean that we can't do well for ourselves, because there are Indians today that are doing very well for themselves. They've just found another area, rather than, okay, well, these are all blocked. Let me put in a couple other spaces. Let me put in a couple other opportunities. So they're making it. So that's what I mean when I say we are put here, all of our ancestors that went through what they went through, not for us just to survive and try to get past go, but to create our own spaces, create our own spots so that we can thrive.
Right.
So, I mean, that's kind of how I look at it, but that's what what I mean when I say the recurring effects about it. So
It's funny. It's not funny, but and then when the casino deals started going really well, and like some are making a lot of money, and then there's ways. I'll have to look into this more, but the federal government was trying to get their hand in on that. No, the state. I think it was the state, actually, and I think it was unfortunately Oklahoma trying to do that. So I'll have to do a lot of more research on that, but I wouldn't put it past them. Even when something starts going well,
yeah,
that they want their hand in it. So no, not unless that camera is all yours. If you want to tell it anything, anything you think you need to tell or something like that.
Other than, like I'd mentioned before, I mean, I would encourage people, the best thing to do for not just natives but non-natives is to, like you do, do your own research. Don't take somebody's word for it. Right. Do your own research. But best way to find something out is to go to the source. Go to, like I mentioned, go to like the Indigenous Peoples Remembrance Day. Go to whenever they have powwows at, like I said, at the Mid-America All Indian Museum. Go to those types of events, those cultural events. They're free and open to the public. And we'd encourage you. I mean, because then that way you can find out and you can see it and ask questions. And I would say don't be afraid to ask questions, because that's where you're going to get the answers. Don't just, oh, well, I've seen this or this, so, and then form an opinion. Just ask, because sometimes it's not always what you think. But like you had mentioned earlier, there's a reason for everything. Just ask. And that's what I encourage a lot of my friends, and a lot of my friends have gone to like powwows that the program I run puts on, or even any other powwows. They'll ask certain things about dancers or songs, or because the songs are even different. So they ask those questions and they get the answers, and they're that much. Then that's when, like I said, that's when that education gap closes,
right?
Which is what we need.
And then we can start appreciating each other's, cultures and diversity. Like, I think all those terms like diversity and, being a diverse culture, anything like that, has been spun the wrong way these days. Yeah. It's kind of like been a border, or a barrier, and it shouldn't be. It should be accepting people and understanding what how they live their life or where they came from, and just all those things like that, rather than everything being a fight on Twitter or something like that.
Yeah, exactly.
But I greatly appreciate you taking your time out of your day.
Oh, no problem. Thank you. I appreciate the invite. Yeah.
Yeah, no problem. I'm sure we could have you back again someday and go down this trail a little bit further. So.
Yeah, definitely. Love to. Thank you. But again, thank you for having me out. So.
Okay. Yep. Thank you very much.
Thank you.